All right. Well, it's great to be together again. If you're new here, typically on a normal Sunday, what we like to do is take our messages and we group them together in some kind of series with a common theme. But this week, we're going to take a little break from doing that and talk about something that we've talked about before, but it's something we have to come back to over and over and over again. Whether you're someone who's new to church, whether you've been in church for years and years, or even if you've left the church, or maybe your whole life you've wanted to keep your distance from the church. This is one of those things that we have to come back to over and over again. So I'll tell you a little story. When I was in fourth grade, maybe fifth grade, I don't know, around like elementary school, I asked for a basketball hoop for my birthday, and I got it. And I was super excited. My dad and we went out to Sports Authority. I got one with one of those nice glass backboards, had this like gray outline. I was thrilled. It was the first time I was getting something like this. We brought it back to my house. It was in this big box, and right away, my dad and I tear into the box and decide we're gonna start putting this thing together. Now, he does what you're supposed to do. He takes out the instructions, and he starts building the thing from the base, right? But not me. I was really excited about this backboard, and I wanted to see what the thing looked like, with the rim on it and the net. And so I went for the backboard and the rim, and I started assembling it. And I was doing everything the right way, but I just wasn't supposed to do it at that time, And I finally get to see it, and he's over there still doing the boring stuff, but I feel like I get to see what it looks like. And then it came time to put the thing together, to put the top part on the bottom part, and we couldn't get it quite right because the top part wasn't supposed to be assembled at that point. But I had kind of put us in that situation. To make a long story short, that hoop ended up never living up to the expectations I had for it. If you hit it from the side too hard, it would be crooked. Eventually, I broke it, probably within about a year and a half. It just didn't end up working right. And it was really because it wasn't done in the right order. And here's my point, and you know this. Sometimes you can do all the right things, but do them in the wrong order, and it's enough to mess everything up, right? If you've ever put something together or maybe cooked something, there's something to be said about the order. And when it comes to God and faith and the church and following Jesus, or whatever you want to call it, order, specifically the order of one thing, one relationship. If we get this wrong, it has the ability to ruin the whole thing, or at least your concept of the whole thing. If you're someone who's been in church for a while, and honestly, though you might not articulate it this way, if honestly the whole idea of Christianity feels like a weight or an obligation you have to carry, this is why. If you've kept your distance or left the church because you didn't want any part of that weight, the ball and chain, the obligation, this is why. It's one thing that's out of order. If we get it right, the whole idea of following Jesus can become the most exciting, attractive thing in your life. If we get it wrong, it ruins the whole thing. So picture this, right? There was once a time when the church as a whole, in its early days, was the hot new release. You remember Blockbuster? When a movie first came out and there was a whole wall, there were 96 versions of the same tape, right? Anybody? Is anyone? Yeah? Okay, right? The new releases, right? The hot new release, everybody wants it. This was the idea of the church. Everybody wanted to get in on it. Or maybe Blockbuster's a little bit out there, okay? You remember frozen yogurt, when those self-serve places started popping up? Like Red Mango and Sweet Frog. Anybody? Yeah. I remember the first time I heard about this. My mom told me. She was like, yeah, there's this new place called Red Mango's in Stony Brook. She's like, those soft serve machines? Yeah, they got a bunch of them. And you can do it yourself. And I didn't believe her. It was like, up to that point in my life, the machine, it was reserved for the people with like the apron and the visor, and you don't get to touch it if you don't got that, And she's like, oh, and it's not just chocolate and vanilla. It's like peanut butter, cake batter, mint, straw, all these different flavors. You do it just yourself, like one of the pros. And then you take your ice cream and you bring it over to the topping bar. Yeah, remember like when you had to be behind the glass wall and just like hope they put enough sprinkles on your ice? Now you can dump it yourself. You could be gross. You could put caramel with the Sour Patch Kids. Do like all this freedom. I couldn't believe it. Went there and it was as good as I thought it was gonna be. Then they start like popping up everywhere, right? Every state where I went to school, there are all these soft serve places. It was amazing. It was the new hot thing. This was like the church, right? The church in its early form, it gave people this newfound freedom, and they started popping up all over the place. Like everybody wanted a piece of this whole idea of following Jesus. Now there was one guy who we talk about a lot. His name's Paul. He might be the most influential person who's ever lived other than Jesus himself, right? Paul started a lot of these churches. And there was one church in particular that he was especially fond of, but didn't start. And this was the church in Rome. Like Rome. He loved the church in Rome, but had never been there. And he wanted to go there. It was like one of his life goals to go to Rome, because at that time, the whole world was basically run by Rome. And he's like, if I could get into that church and have a position of influence there, and that church could be healthy, like there's no telling how far this whole Jesus movement could spread. So he's got this dream of going to Rome. He can't make it there for a while. So he decides to write a letter. This letter we call Romans. We actually still have it. It's in the Bible. He writes this letter to them, and because he's never been there, he's got to cover the whole thing. Like Christianity, A to Z, beginning to end. He explains like all the spiritual stuff in the first part, and then he explains all the practical stuff in the second part. It's fascinating. Some parts are a little confusing, but you should read it for yourself, right? Romans, all the spiritual stuff, all the practical stuff. And he writes this letter to them, and they get it, and this letter becomes pretty famous. It covers so much. So that's Romans. Now, if you're like me, all right, I'm a real practical guy. I just want to be told what to do. So when I came to this letter that we call Romans, the whole like spiritual part, the first 11 chapters, it covers all these like deep theological ideas, things like justification, propitiation, sanctification, glorification, all the like ifications, and the things nobody in here woke up thinking about this morning. And so I'm like, okay, all that, like that's exciting, nice, but let's like take all of it, put it in a box, and leave it to the experts who are fascinated by fascinating things like that. I just want to know, give me the quick start guide, right? Like tell me what to do. So for me, like I'd start halfway in the practical part where Paul says, okay, here's how you do this whole Christianity thing. And this is where a lot of us start, right? He says this, he says, therefore I urge you, I invite you, brothers and sisters. He's talking to people that he loves. He says, I urge you, brothers and sisters, to, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice. Give it all, he says, holy and pleasing to God. He says, this is your true and proper worship. Now, it might seem like for a second, like the spiritual part kind of seeped into the practical part, but this is actually like pretty practical. He's talking to people who understand the sacrificial system. And so he's saying, like, don't give a dead sacrifice. Give one, let your life be one that's alive. Like, do everything here to please God. And then he says some pretty inspiring things. Some like pretty nifty to-dos and also some to-don'ts. He says, devote yourselves to one another in love. All right? He says to bless those who curse you. All right, that's extreme, but if you're in the right mood, that hits in a good place. I can do that. Right? He says, he talks about serving one another, treating other people better than yourselves. And he gives some pretty cool, even in some places poetic to-dos and some to-don'ts. And so if you're like me, you hear those, maybe it was after a really good church service, or maybe you heard your favorite Christian song on the radio, and it's all right, I got this. And I'm in, I'm gonna try, I'm gonna offer myself as a living sacrifice. I'm gonna give everything. I'm gonna try as hard as I can to do all these things and check all these boxes because I want to be pleasing to God, right? This is the framework for a lot of people. I'll give everything so that God will be happy with me. It's really, though maybe you never articulate it like this, for me, it was a very simple formula. It's if I do the do's and don't the don'ts, if I offer myself, if I listen to him, if I obey God, he'll be happy with me. He'll be pleased with me. He'll accept me, right? I'll be good with God. It's this idea of if I obey him, he will accept me. It starts with me and then it ends with him. And this is the framework for a lot of people. It might be your framework now, and it makes sense if it is. This is how a lot of our relationships look like in the real world. And so maybe, like I said, there's a time where you get super motivated and you're like, I'm doing this, I'm in. And you give it your best shot. And then there's this situation where you might do the wrong thing, but you're like, oh no, I'm doing that whole give everything thing, and you don't do what you might have done 3 weeks ago. And you feel pretty good. And you're like, all right, I did it. God must be pretty happy with me. And it starts to feel good. Maybe you build up a little momentum, right? Make some progress. But eventually it kind of wears off a little bit, Like in the same way, if you've ever done one of those diets from a Netflix documentary, it's like, oh, this guy, he ate cardboard for 3 months and now he can fly. I'm eating cardboard. There are these radical diets, and I've tried a lot of them. And it's like, okay, it starts off good. You spend all your money on the crazy expensive stuff because it works in the plan. And then after a while, it's like, no, I'm eating ice cream, right? And it kind of can get that way. You're faced with life. The motivation wears off. And pretty quickly, it starts to lead to an uncomfortable place, right? Because you start to read these things like blessing those who curse you, devoting yourself to serving other people. And it seems like a pretty impossible standard. It seems like God has this standard that's pretty impossible to reach. And if my standing with him is based on me being able to get it right, then pretty quickly I start living in a world of rejection, of shame, of guilt, of inadequacy. And I know that describes a lot of the way a lot of people feel about God. You think about God, it's just like, I'm not doing what I should, because his standard is here, and I'm here. I'm imperfect. I've got issues. And you know what happens in a relationship where you feel like you can't please someone? Eventually, there's distance there. When someone's got a standard for you, it's just impossible to reach. Eventually, you get tired of trying to reach that standard those relationships that you have with people that are impossible to please, you don't have friends with those standards because you wouldn't hang out with them if you didn't have to. Usually these are people that you're related to if you have people like this in your life, because you put up with those relationships. You don't seek them out. And for a lot of us, we are putting up with that relationship with God, who feels like he's impossible to please because his standard is so high and my motivation wore off. And so we live in this world of just like trying, failing, beating ourselves up, and then eventually like creating some distance. This is the type of faith that people have. They go to college with, and they just hope some professor is gonna prove their whole faith wrong so they can finally be freed from this cycle of condemnation. For me, it was a cycle that looked like this. It was like motivation. Oh, I went to that church service. I heard what that lady said. That song at the part where, I just loved it when they hit the bridge, and that was the moment, and I'm doing it, right? And then life happens, and it's like I fail, so now I'm gonna beat myself up and live in condemnation, right? Just feel like I'm just such a mess. I said I wasn't gonna do it again, but I did it again. I said I was gonna break that habit, but I can't. I thought this was real, but maybe it's not. And then what happens is maybe you kind of, work your way through the mud for a while, and then it's like, all right, I'll give it another chance. And we're back at rededication. Okay, I'm in. And so now we're back at motivation. And then you fail again, and it's back to condemnation, rededication. And really, really, all of this is just based on fear. Like, fear is the fuel in this cycle. It's the fear of like, well, if there is somebody up there, I want to land on his good side. It's the just in case kind of faith. And so I'll go because I have to, just in case. But it's living in this motivation, condemnation, rededication over and over and over again. And it's exhausting. That's a faith that people want to come out of. And what then happens is the way that you see the world starts to become resentful. You want to know why the church has earned itself a reputation of being judgmental? It's because people who live here look at the rest of the world and they're like, if I'm gonna live in this, you should have to too. And so how could you not be trying as hard as I am, and yet you look like you're having a good time? And so we decide to make ourselves the moral police of the world, but really it's coming from a place of our own shame and inadequacy. And all of this comes back to the model, the framework, which initially seems harmless, the framework of if I obey him, he will accept me. The framework that starts with me. The good news is that that's totally backwards. It's out of order. The whole idea of the Christian faith does not start with you and what you do. It starts with God and what he's done. Let's put that verse back up here again. Remember I said there were 11 chapters, all the ifications, and then this therefore. This one word here. One word has the power to change everything. You see, therefore, to put it in other words, you could say, therefore means so because of that, right? And so if you were to read this like, so because of that, I urge you, you'd say, because of what? Right? When you see a therefore, you should ask, well, what is that there for? You like that? What came before this? And what might seem like spiritual fluff, like all the ifications, are really the people that Paul's writing to, it's the thing they were yearning for. To summarize it, right? And I'm overgeneralizing here. You should read it for yourself. He says, basically he connects with everybody. And he's like, all of us, no matter how you classify yourself, whether you're someone who doesn't care about God, someone who considers themselves a moralist, or even someone who's religious, all of us are falling short of the standard that we want to be at. All of us. Like, even if you want nothing to do with God, you and your friend group have some kind of standard. And if you're honest with yourself, you probably struggle to live up to that standard that you have set. He touches on this universal brokenness to get everyone in the room feeling like, yeah, okay, you're right. You're right. But then he explains how like God steps into the story. And how really a relationship with God was never based on performance to begin with. How a relationship with God, like a relationship with other people, is built on trust. He tells a story about a guy named Abraham who trusted him. And then he goes on to explain how worthy of trusting God is. He explains how the whole idea of Jesus on a cross, dying on the cross, it's not just giving us something to talk about around Easter. He's like, in essence, he says, you at your worst, you need to understand that when you are at your worst, like at rock bottom, feeling like a complete failure, wanting nothing to do with God, it's at that moment you need to understand just how far Jesus is willing to go for you while you're in that state. He says that Jesus dying on the cross was a demonstration of that. He showed us just how far he would go. And in doing that, we're freed from the perform your way to God model. Like, we don't have to play that game anymore. He's like, Jesus in doing that, like, he met that requirement for you. So you don't have to play by those rules anymore. You don't have to work your way to God. He explains how, like, over time, this changes you. Understanding that. And he gets to this point, my favorite part's around chapter 8, where it's like he just almost starts celebrating, like rambling as he's writing. He's like, so how do you respond to this? What do we say to this? He says, if God is for you, like if he's in your corner, in spite of your performance, in spite of your doubts, in spite of your failures, in spite of what you did last night or last weekend, if he's for you and in your corner, who can be against you? Like, what else does it matter? He says, if there's like, it's as if God can even take the difficult things in your life and use them for your good. He says, I'm convinced that there is nothing that can separate us from how God feels about us. Nothing we do, nothing that happens to us. And it's like he's celebrating. It's like he's on top of the world just going. And then he gets to this place where he stops. And he says, so because of that, since you don't have to perform your way to God, in light of that, he says, I urge you, brothers and sisters, he's talking to people that he loves. He says, in view of God's mercy, not mercy like I used to play mercy with my sister. We'd try and like twist each other's hands until someone yelled uncle, right? We call that mercy. No, mercy like compassion. In light of just how much God cares for you. He says, offer your bodies as a living sacrifice. Now, back then, we don't really do sacrifices here. Back then, sacrifice primarily was offered either to cover guilt or to express gratitude. And he's just explained that your guilt is covered. He's saying, like, live your life completely as an expression of gratitude. He says this is holy and it's pleasing to God. Not holy like traditional religious, but holy like set apart. Like it's different. You'll stand out. That's what Jesus meant when he said, you're the light in this world. And pleasing, like a father is pleased when he sees his children doing what's best for them. And then he says, this is your true and proper worship. This phrase here in the original language, it comes from the Greek word logikos. It's one word, it's where we get the word logical. Other English translations translate this by saying your reasonable form of worship. He's saying, like, it just makes sense. If there's someone who's in your corner, if the one who like controls it all says, you're good with me, I'm crazy about you, I wanna have a relationship with you, I care more about you than you'll ever understand. He's saying, well then live your life as an expression of gratitude. Not in that performance model, like trying to work your way, but just live your life as one big, joyful expression of gratitude. And then he goes into, like, he breaks it down what it looks like. He's like, so devote yourselves to one another in love. He's like, when people don't treat you well, don't return them with that kind of treatment. Treat them better than that. You've got something so life-changingly grateful to. You've got something to be really grateful for, and let that drive you. In other words, it's not if he will. It's because I will. Because of everything he's done, I'll listen to him. Because he's in my corner, I want him calling the shots. And you see this over and over and over again all throughout the New Testament. You'll see, because you've been forgiven, you should forgive. Because God's loved you, you should love other people. Because God hasn't given you what you deserve, you shouldn't give other people what they deserve. This becomes the model. Because I will. You're responding. Or we can say, like, this whole idea of following Jesus, Christianity, whatever you want to call it, obeying God is not the requirement for his love. It's the response to it. And that changes everything. That takes a faith that's heavy and makes it light. Like when the good feelings wear off, because they will, and they do, and you blow it, and you mess up, instead of going into that cycle of condemnation and rededication, instead of running from God, he's someone you go to. Because your acceptance in his eyes is not based on whether you got last night right or wrong. It's based on who you are to him because of what Jesus has done. It changes everything. You know, the way you see other people who aren't doing what you're doing goes from judgment to understanding and compassion. From looking down on people, from resenting them, to actually caring. Because it's not this feeling like you have to pay a debt and they should have to as well. It changes everything. So, I mean, that's it. My question for you is, when you think about Jesus, Christianity, the church, whatever your relationship is to it, maybe you're totally embracing it, maybe you want nothing to do with it. Do you understand it? Does it feel like a debt owed or a debt paid? Does it feel like a bill or the tax return? Does it feel like a weight you have to carry or a weight that's been lifted? It all comes back to the order. Is it if he will, or because I will? So what's the next step for you then? Maybe you've been here for a while, maybe you've been hearing this, and maybe it's time to take a step in that direction. Maybe it's as small as praying a prayer. We're gonna sing a song together in just a minute. Maybe during that song, just silently to yourself, you tell God, I know I haven't measured up, but because of what you've done for me, I don't have to play that game anymore. And I want to see you as someone I run to, not run from. Maybe it's that simple. Maybe it's getting baptized at Sunday dinner. This isn't one long commercial for baptism, but we believe that inward decisions should be accompanied by outward expressions. In the same way, I wear a ring around my finger to express the inward decision, my inward commitment to my wife. Maybe that's a step you want to take. But the big question is what is the version of Christianity you've come to understand? If I, or because he? I'm going to ask the band to come up here, but here's the picture I want to leave you with. And maybe this will help. I have a daughter. Right now she's 8 years old. But years ago, I kind of developed this habit with her where I would reward intentionally her good behavior. I wanted not just to correct her bad behavior, but also reward when she had done things well. And so for her, it's food. She loves to eat, loves snacks. And what would happen is she would do something, and I would call her over. I'd say, like, I love that you did that, and I want to give you something. I'd give her, like, a piece of candy or whatever. And I'd say, Mia, do you know why you're getting this? And she would say, why? And I'd say, because you're a good girl. And I wanted to teach her that good choices led to good outcomes, right? And eventually she caught on to this. And I would call her over. I'd say, Mia, I've got something for you. Do you know why you're getting this? And she would say, because I'm a good girl. It would happen over and over and over again. But then eventually I started to get concerned. And this isn't parenting advice. This is just experience. I got a little concerned that maybe she would begin to think that her relationship with me was contingent on whether or not she was doing the right thing. And so one day I called her over. I said, Mia, come here. I've got something for you. I said, do you know why you're getting this? And she said, because I'm a good girl. And I said, no. It's because you're mine and I love you. And she looked at me and she said, no, it's because I'm a good girl. I wanted her to understand that there was nothing she could do that could change who she was and what she meant to me. And maybe today for you, the inner workings of your heart have you trying to convince God that you're a good boy or a good girl. And maybe today you need to know and hear him say that there is nothing you can do that can change who you are and what you mean to me. And so, therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, to give everything, to live your life completely as an expression of gratitude. What other way could we possibly respond to that kind of news?